Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com. This map shows where the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has daily temperature data from the years 1891 to 1920. As you can see, there's little or no historical daily temperature data for the vast majority of the planet, and the lion's share of data which is available is from the United States. This makes the United States temperature record very important for understanding any changes in climate which have occurred over the last 130 years. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the frequency of hot days in the United States was much higher prior to 60 years ago, particularly during the 1930s and 1950s. This graph shows the average number of days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius. In 1936, U.S. stations averaged more than 35 days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Recent years, it's been less than 15. The graph on the left shows 95-degree days, and the graph on the right shows 90-degree days. You can see that there were a lot more days over 90 degrees in the United States prior to 1960 than there have been over the last 60 years. The National Climate Assessment shows the same thing. The length of heat waves was much longer prior to 60 years ago. The intensity was much higher, and the hottest temperature was much higher as well. The blue dots on this map show locations in the United States where peak temperatures have been cooler over the last 60 years than they were from 1901 to 1960. The available data shows that afternoon temperatures in the United States were much hotter prior to 1960 than recent generations have experienced. Now I'm going to focus on one location in the United States, Bloomington, Indiana, where Indiana University is located. This graph shows the number of 90-degree days at Bloomington, Indiana for every year since 1895. In 1936, Bloomington had 77 days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This year, they only had 4. Once again, you can see that there were a lot more 90-degree days at Bloomington prior to 1960 than there have been over the last 60 years. This graph shows all 2,790 days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit recorded at Bloomington, Indiana since 1895. As you can see, hot days were not only more common at Bloomington prior to 1960, but they were also much hotter, reaching 110 degrees in 1936. The New York Times claims they did an analysis of this. Let's take a look at what they came up with. 5 years ago, the New York Times published this webpage. How much hotter is your hometown than when you were born? As the world warms because of human-induced climate change, most of us can expect to see more days when temperatures hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. See how your hometown has changed so far and how much hotter it may get. It isn't clear where they came up with that idea because the National Climate Assessment shows the exact opposite. Hot days were a lot more common and a lot hotter prior to 1960. Anyway, let's go back to the New York Times webpage and type in Bloomington, Indiana and see what comes up. They have a menu which allows us to go back to the year 1920 for our birth year to find out how much Bloomington has heated since then. So I'm going to select 1920 and now let's see what happens. They come up with a message that says, "Our data set goes back to 1960 when you were 40. Back then, the Bloomington, Indiana area could expect about 20 days per year to reach at least 90 degrees. Well, that's very interesting. Why does their data set only go back to 1960? NOAA has data for Bloomington going back to 1895. And here's their graph. They say that the average number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at Bloomington, Indiana has increased slightly since 1960. Today, the Bloomington, Indiana area can expect 23 days at or above 90 degrees per year on average. And then they say, by the end of the century, models show that there could be 49 of these very hot days. The likely range is between 32 and 75 days. We've seen the New York Times propaganda. Now let's go back and look at the actual data once again. It's pretty clear why the New York Times made the decision to hide all the data before 1960, and that's because there were a lot more 90-degree days prior to 1960 than there have been over the last 60 years. The New York Times said that people living in Bloomington can expect to see about 23 days over 90 degrees per year. Over the past decade, they've been averaging much less than that. And this year, during what the New York Times claims was a record hot summer in the United States, Bloomington only had 4 days over 90 degrees, down from 77 days in 1936. Over the last 100 years, the frequency of hot days at Bloomington, Indiana has sharply declined. The New York Times chose to hide all of the data before 1960, which wrecked their story. Instead, they chose to use fake models, which show a trend which is the opposite of what's actually been recorded. The New York Times is misinforming the readers both about past historical trends and about what's likely to happen in the future. But what I find to be most interesting from the New York Times fraud is that they designed the website to go back to 1920. Apparently, when they realized that showing data prior to 1960 wrecked their story, they decided to truncate their database. And this isn't just for Bloomington, they did exactly the same thing for every other location in the United States. This New York Times webpage is an obvious fraud, attempting to misinform the readers about the past, present, and the future. People pushing the climate scam will of course complain that I only show data for the United States. But as I pointed out at the beginning of this video, the United States is one of very few locations on Earth where it's even possible to do this sort of analysis. This story of New York Times fraud is already pretty awful, but it gets worse. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has assisted them in this fraud. This is a plot of NOAA's Climate Extremes Index showing contiguous U.S. extremes in maximum summer temperature. The graph shows that the area of the United States affected by very hot summer afternoon temperatures has increased to record highs over the last few decades. But this is the exact opposite of what the National Climate Assessment shows. The thermometer data shows that the percent of the United States reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the year has sharply declined since the peak year of 1931. This decline in the area of the United States affected by very hot temperatures has occurred as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have increased. Reality is the exact opposite of the propaganda which the New York Times is trying to promote. And the same thing is true for 100-degree days. In 1936, 79% of the United States reached 100 degrees. This year, the percentage was less than 30. So let's take a look at how NOAA created this completely fake graph. The pink graph shows measured afternoon temperatures in the United States over the last century, which have sharply declined. But NOAA tampers with the data to turn this cooling trend into a warming trend. NOAA temperature graphs are completely fraudulent, as is their Climate Extremes Index, which was generated from the tampered data. What we're seeing is government agencies and the press colluding to misinform the public. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on the climate scam for more than 15 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki Upala, and the 4 new puppies on the web at realclimatescience.com.